Hello, my name is Gilagius, and I'm going to present to you the test run of the evening for the Psychosyntheses Föreningen for working with trauma. And there wouldn't be a recording of the evening because people might share personal things, and we want to create a safe space for everyone who's participating. So that's why we didn't like the recording. But then I had this idea that I might as well record as my test run, and then the Vereniging can decide if they want to distribute this to people who couldn't be there or people who want to see it again. So this is what I'm presenting to you. So I'll do it as if I'm doing it on the evening, which is tomorrow from this moment of recording, 25th of March, 2026. So where I would start is for you to just take a moment, and if you want, you can close your eyes or you can keep your eyes open and just take a moment to tune in and to make contact with yourself and just feel your body being present at this moment. Perhaps you have your feet on the ground. You might be sitting with your legs, your back resting against the chair or the couch, wherever you're sitting, perhaps on the ground. And just take some time to follow the breath and to notice the presence of your body, the quality of presence. Taking some time to get more and more in touch with your body and just scanning through the different parts of your body, just in your own pace and as you choose to do so. And just making sure that you pass all the different parts of your body. When we say quality of presence, it's if there's any feelings, sensations in the body that you might become aware of. Could be a nice feeling, something you label as pleasant. Could be a level of discomfort or even pain. Could be there are parts of your body that you don't really feel any connection to. Kind of numbness. And without labeling or judging any of these, just noticing, so bringing in your awareness. And why we do this is not to change the state of your body, but just to tune into your body, to ask your body how it's doing this moment as you're watching this video. And perhaps spend some more times with the breath and your breathing. And notice the subtle expansion of your body as you breathe in. The chest, the belly expanding. Every in-breath, allowing the expansion. So not to hold, to tighten, just to allow the expansion. And when you breathe out, the body relaxes again and contracts. And notice the little pause there is once you finish the out breath before you breathe in again. As well as when you've breathed in, it's this little moment before you breathe out again. And just follow that for a while. And then ask your body how it's doing at this moment. How's your body doing? If it has an answer in the language of the body, the answer doesn't have to be one single answer, it could be different answers. And also become aware of any feelings and emotions that might be present for you right now. not so much about engaging with these feelings and emotions. It's again bringing your awareness to them. What am I aware of that I'm experiencing right now as an emotion, as a feeling? See if you are willing to let go and see if anything new emerges inside you, something else you become aware of. Acknowledging the inner diversity of your feelings and emotions that you hold inside yourself, part of your experience as a human being. As you're reflecting on this, also expanding the awareness to thoughts, thinking, the mind. So what was your day like so far? What is present for you, and particularly what you might be anticipating for when you chose to be looking at and listening to this recording on trauma. Perhaps you are looking for answers, you're curious, you want to try to understand certain things of your own lived experience. And of course, what we'll talk about tonight is the work with clients. So what is your clinical experience? What are your clinical questions that you hold and you hope to find answers for? And just allowing yourself to be curious. And perhaps also there's an anticipation for what you might hear, things that land well in you or things that might startle you a little bit. Just bring awareness to whatever is present for you. And then we'll spend just the last few moments of this arrival exercise in silence and with the awareness that at this moment you don't have to do anything, you don't have to go anywhere. Just bring your presence into your awareness. Gently bring your attention back into the space where you are right now. And if you were at the meeting, then this would be a nice moment to check in with somebody, which you're not going to do because you're just watching the recording. So I'm just going to start the presentation now and share that with you so you can read along with me as I read it and say a little bit more around it, what I mean. So yeah, we called this presentation the do's and don'ts in working with trauma because we only have 2 hours for the evening. So we're just kind of reducing it to a few key points, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight, with an intention that although we are not always aware of it, we're not always working actively or not, but as therapists, we always work with trauma. And how can we work with trauma responsibly? What can we do in terms of interventions? What might be less helpful in therapy? So, and there's some processing in the small groups if you were attending the evening, and space for questions. So you're just listening to the part, the theoretical part that I'm going to share with you. And just to be clear, and as always, that I'm not telling you the truth. I'll tell you what my perspective is, from which I share this with you. So you might have other ideas around this. You might have heard other people have other ideas. And there's not one way to look at this. And you might agree and not always agree with everything that I share. So my background is through psychosynthesis, which is my basic model. It's my first training as a psychotherapist. I do, by the way, work in Amsterdam, and I train in different European countries and non-European countries meanwhile. But I've trained in somatic experiencing, which is a body psychotherapy, mostly focused at trauma therapy. I've trained in the neuroaffective relational model, which is a model that specifically looks at childhood trauma and how to work with that with newer adult individuals. And I've done loads of other stuff, including EMDR, heart rate variability, which is a very direct intervention on the body, like EMDR is as well, somatic embodiment and specific trainings on sexual trauma. So the check-in we skip because you're not with others right now. But the key point of that was that if you work with somebody, you check in with somebody, we get in touch with co-regulation. And co-regulation means that your regulated state supports the other one to regulate themselves, which is a lot the case when the therapist meets the client. And this can also happen, of course, between colleagues or just between individuals if somebody is in a regulated state. The presence, your presence, is a key here, because if you are present, then you can offer this co-regulating space. If you are not present, if you're busy with your thoughts, if you're thinking of what to do or there's feelings around, it takes you away from presence. So also as a therapist, we can be aware of how much presence we can have in a moment when meeting our clients. And there will be moments with clients that you lose the presence because of whatever they bring, the process between you, the emotions of the client that might affect you, or it might be that you in your personal life are experiencing feelings and emotions that affect your presence as well. It's a foundation though, so it's helpful if you work with trauma that you as a therapist are regulated. You can read this quote from Furman and Gilla, which is that our intrinsic, authentic sense of self is plunged into the experience of annihilation and non-being. Child abuse and neglect, sexist and racist culture and bonding to wounded caregivers are just a few of the very many ways we receive their primal wounding, as Furman and Gilla refer to this. You know, you're familiar with the concept, no doubt. However, the wounding is inflicted. It is the break in the intricate web of relationships in which we live, move, and have our being. So I think it's a beautiful way to look at the impact of trauma on an individual. Now, how to signal this when you are working with somebody. So how do you notice you're working with trauma is through the four, well, familiar to you, responses of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, feign in English. So you notice it when the client gets agitated, there's irritation, there might be even rage, could be physically tense, that somebody's in a flight response, a fight response, fight. The flight response, let's get out of here, when somebody gets into avoidance, there could be panic, fear, anxiety, it could be addictions, and somebody's usually physically mobile, so less together, you could say twitchy, there could be sudden movements because somebody wants to move out, right? Somebody moving their feet all the time, for example, restless hands, they could all be signs of flight response. The freeze is when somebody is dissociated, numb, despair, hopelessness, could be depression, as you can imagine. And there could be a rigidity, like kind of as if you're looking into dead eyes, as if there's nobody home. And the feign fawn response is when there's codependent behavior, somebody who's denying their own existence, their needs, just to tend to the needs of others. And there, if you look at it from a body therapy perspective, often physically floppy, so they're not very well kind of contained in themselves. So we're not going to exchange the two, but the questions you can ask yourself if you're just watching this video afterwards is what kind of trauma, not if trauma, what kind of traumas do you work with? What are your basic guidelines in working with these traumata? What are your boundaries in the work? And what do you do when you hit these boundaries? So what are the edges of your capacity professionally, personally? Why I say that is because I'm going to ask you to reflect also on perhaps there are clients that you cannot work with simply because they are too complex. They have so little capacity that we cannot do the therapy that we offer in our private practice. So they need to have a bigger container with different people holding that container, different modalities, different type of therapy, perhaps medication for somebody to be supported through their journey. So if we just looked at 3 other trauma definitions from other theorists, trauma is an invisible force that shapes our lives. It shapes the way we live, the way we love, the way we make sense of the world. It's the root of our deepest wounds. And Gabor Mate also says trauma is not about what happened to you, but how that affects you in the here and now. This is a very important point for this whole presentation. In the work that we see, it's not about what happened then, it's about how somebody relates to that now. Life is full of stress, wherein your body can go back to feeling safe and calm, but trauma refers to stress so extreme that you can't return to baseline. So this is Bessel van der Kolk, you're also probably familiar with. And Peter Levine says the overwhelm of the nervous system happens when an event is impactful and either too fast, it was too fast, you didn't see it coming, too strong, so you can't cope with it, too unexpected, so it came out of nowhere, or there was too little, so just too fast, too strong, too unexpected, too little. This is an easy way to remind yourself when there was support, love, attunement, sensitivity needed, and it was not there, which then leads to the trauma to stuck in the system. It's good to differentiate because there's so many different types of trauma. Just a few: high impact trauma, like a car accident, skiing accident; collective trauma, like what you see in the world where there's wars happening. Could be like shared experience, like some people experience the same thing, like accidents in a stadium where, well, there's different examples of that, where an accident happens, like something crashing, or people want to get out and get pressed, so there's something collectively happening. Medical trauma, so from could be breaking your leg, but it could also be from operations that something goes wrong. There's a much longer process of healing than expected. Of course, violence, early childhood trauma, sexual trauma, etc., etc. And why we differentiate this? Because they all work out differently and therefore need a different approach. So there's different protocols in somatic experiencing how you work with the different types of trauma, and they really fundamentally are different. And I won't go through all the protocols because that's a 3-year training, which I can't just present to you in a few days. Interestingly is that in DSM there is not a diagnosis for trauma as such, but we do have some things that of course refer to trauma, and there's a lot of material, a lot of stuff out there because trauma is big in the therapy world, so there's a lot of resources that we can use. I just want to mention that there's also an inflation of the word trauma in the sense that people quite easily say that they were traumatized by something when they've experienced something that was unpleasant. But we really need to go back to the definitions I gave earlier. It's about that something was so upsetting that the system doesn't go back to baseline. That is when we talk about trauma. I'm talking a lot about identifications in this short presentation and about beliefs, because human people are not stupid, but they're not always aware of what's happening. And what I mean with this is that if we experience something that's overwhelming, we don't forget it and we give a meaning to it, right? We start to value it, we start to judge it, sometimes rightfully, like this shouldn't have happened or that was painful. But it could also be that it leads to strong identifications. And just a few examples, like if you've been violated and your amygdala is overly active, then others might feel as a threat quite strongly and quite fast, even if there's no real threat, no actual threat. Another example is that if there are strong physical and emotional reactions to a trigger from something in the past. For example, I once had a car crash when I was driving in the snow. So it took quite a few years after that each time when I was driving the car, I was driving in the snow very quietly, no chance of slipping or getting into an accident, but my nervous system kind of thought like, there's a threat here, be careful. So it doesn't have to be bad, but it can be quite, it can be quite in the way of picking up normal life. So I wouldn't call my car accident traumatic, but the trauma response was there, if you want to put it that way. Animals shake it off and they move on. And we as humans, we brace ourselves and we kind of, through evolutionary reasons, probably we've lost this capacity to shake it off. And I'll show you just a short video. If it works. And we start. So this animal has been caught by a leopard. It's an impala. And there's somebody coming to rescue, which is a baboon in this case. I didn't put on the sound, it doesn't matter because it's about the visuals. So the immediate threat is gone, but the animal, as soon as it got caught, got into a freeze state. So it's as if it's dead. If you look at it, it's dead, right? And what we're going to look at now is how the body is going to wake up again and going to get back to state. But for that, it first needs to process the trauma. So you see there's hardly any breathing. And then notice when the breathing comes back in, because there's hardly any oxygen coming into the system. Is the threat gone? There was a jaguar there. Another prey animal, another animal trying to find the deer. So it has its eyes open, so it's looking at it, and there you see the breath coming. So very deep breathing, because the system is coming back online, right? So the immediate threat is gone. Look at how deeply it's breathing. And then comes the next, which is to get rid of the trauma response. So from the freeze, coming back into aliveness. So the breathing is the start, but the body is still half in this trauma response. As you see, the head is still lying on the ground. So the oxygen is coming in, but it's not fully back. See the deep, deep breaths. And here it goes. So now it starts to shake off the trauma. All the stress hormones that were going through the body from the attack. And it needs to be released. So this is a bio release. You can see the mouth kind of moving. So there's all kind of movement it's making to shake off this overwhelming experience that it went through. Of course, this is only possible in this adventurous, in this case of this impala, because there's no immediate threat right now. And this is a phenomenon that we see with a lot of mammals as a way to release trauma. There's a very interesting one, you can find it on YouTube, and look, there it stands up, and there it goes again. Now, if you would see it from this point, you would never know what happened before. So this is how these things work. Let's see how I can get to the next slides. Yeah. So what I just showed you is that the core concept in trauma work is completion. So if we see trauma as something being stuck and incomplete, in the sense of it couldn't have happened, you couldn't have the proper response in the event, you work with that stuckness. Look at it on a neurobiopsychological level. So this response like you saw, is the release of the frozen energy in the body, right? So the animal goes into the freeze, and then it starts to shake off this frozen state. So we work with our clients toward generating capacity in the client to be able to contain the release when they couldn't contain that earlier. But this release can be in many different ways, as long as the moment from the client is, so the movement that the client has to make is made from a place of choice. So are they willingly going through this experience? Of course, there should be safety, and it leads to an expansive state, not just in the moment, but an expansion that lasts longer, that's sustainable long term. And clients might re-traumatize themselves if these conditions are not met. So exercise with consciousness like yoga, Tai Chi, walking, meditation, they are all kind of, could be the start of releasing energies that are stuck in the body. In a therapeutic context, that if a client comes back into a situation where they remember the trauma and they start to relive, we slow them down. We say, okay, just what, and we invite them to think of what movement did they want to make to get out of the situation where they were in, or to do something to change the situation for the good, for their good, right? So for example, if there was an attack, could they run away? Could they hit back? Could they cry for help? Anything that they couldn't do in the moment, can they do it? And then we don't just allow that to happen in SE, in somatic experiencing, we allow the client to make that movement, but very slowly, like push that client away, and notice what happens in your body, and you repeat that movement several times. So we want to do it in a way that the nervous system can catch up with this and can kind of reorganize the memory of the situation into a situation where the client has more agency over that situation. If we look at this in emotional terms, emotions can get stuck because there was no chance to experience them, and then we lose freedom of experience in life now and expression. So the completion, again, in a safe environment like therapy, and from a place of choice and capacity, which means they can contain this, to allow these emotions. For example, you could invite the client once you're at that point, like, what do you need to say, for example, to your ex-partner, to your parent, whoever. There were situations that really were quite impactful, and the client is still reliving, and we give that space very consciously and see what emotions surface. So another example is that if you see the child that you once were, how do you think they felt when, whatever the situation was, you came out of school, and usually one of your parents would pick you up and there was nobody there, and it lasted like an hour, right? What has gone through that child? Because the child probably dissociated, panicked, but it couldn't give the proper response. So the way we look at this is from a disidentified perspective, looking at the child then, so that we don't get into that experience, because there's nothing to change in the past. We're just looking at how could you experience that differently with your client. And if somebody starts to deflect, then we confront that. So we say like, hey, we were talking about this and I see you moving away from that. So what do you notice what's happening right now, right? So that we see that this survival strategy that they get into, let's not go here, that isn't serving anymore, but we'll get back to that a little bit later. So in the meeting with a peer during the evening is just to think of one client that you currently work with and what surfaces in terms of working with trauma from what you heard before. And what could you think of in terms of unprocessed bodily responses and or emotions? And what could you imagine that you could explore with this client in the next session? But this is what you don't do, but you can reflect on these questions. Of course, I won't take the time now, but you can do that at any moment. Same for the questions. So we go to the do's now, and then we'll do the don'ts. So do 1 is know your limitations. So as therapists, we have learned how to do therapy. And of course, that was the basic training. And by practicing, we become more and more skillful over time, right? But do we always know what we're doing is a good question to ask when you work, particularly with complex trauma. Because sometimes clients are really lacking of capacity so strongly that talking therapy isn't doing the trick. And that we have to be quite careful when we start in Psychosynthesis using visualizations, meditations, even imagery, if very strong images, very strong reactions come to the surface and the client doesn't have the capacity to hold them. So I encourage you, is to follow trainings and to stay up to date about what's around, what we know about trauma, and to have enough qualified supervision. So to find a supervisor who really knows how to work with trauma. And there is a risk that we overestimate our capacities because we think we need to help the client or even rescue them, or that we fail if we don't work with the client, but that doesn't necessarily serve the client if we're actually a bit lost in the woods. So we need to know our limitations and acknowledge the complexity of certain clients and then refer on. So if it's too complex, just say like, I really want to help you and you're better helped in another place, even if the client doesn't agree. You make your professional assessment and you hold the boundary firm that they need more than what you just can offer in your private practice, assuming that you do work in private practice. Do number 2, work bottom up, with which we mean working bottom up, right? In case of strong dysregulation of the client, the neocortex goes offline. Somebody's overwhelmed, panicky, panic attacks, dissociated. So we first need to work on the basis, that's bottom up. So the basis needs to be intact. So, however, because dysregulation is a symptom of an underlying unprocessed material process, that because of the lack of capacity, the client moves away from physiological, emotional, could be having beliefs and identifications around how they understand themselves and their reaction to it. So if we see that the client doesn't have enough capacity, then we work directly with the material, and that doesn't necessarily work out well. So we need to, an example of that will be if they keep repeating, bringing the same stories to therapy. So we keep working on the story that they bring to the session. Like there's some issues in the relationship and they keep bringing the stuff that's happening in the relationship, but that just repeats the thing that doesn't really change something in the client. So we need to work on the capacity first and then to see like what makes you stay in this situation, what is stuck in this situation, and I'll address agency later, but it's more about like to bring in the awareness about how they do not change the situation because they don't have the capacity, so that we need to have that capacity so that they can start to think of change. One way to approach that is that we ask the client, what is it that you really deeply long for yourself? So that we start addressing what is it that, how the client wants to live their life. So not how it is now, because otherwise they wouldn't be in therapy probably, how they would want that. And then we start to investigate in that. If they say like, well, I want to be in a healthy relationship, okay, and tell me more. How would that change your life? What would you experience differently? So we go into exploring and inviting in the client's imagination to the effective components of what they say that they want, right? So, for example, they say, I want to feel happy, I want to feel safe, I want to feel supported, and I want to support my partner or whatever. This is just an example, of course. And we check, like, is there an effective component to that? So do they actually get in touch with the real longing inside? And as long as you don't feel that, we keep exploring until we find what they deeply want for themselves, which is not concrete. It's more about a state, a shift in state. If there is some capacity, so from the work, and I'm not going into that in this presentation, but of course, working bottom up, there's all kind of ways you can invite client into more presence from a dissociated state, from a depressed state, from a panic state. So if there's too high or too low activation of the autonomic nervous system. So we work on generating that capacity before we can start to work on what they present as what they think they want in their lives, right? And we've kind of questioned into that. We kind of dive into that as deeply as we need to feel that somebody is really connecting to a different state inside themselves, a different emotion that comes up, right? And you will feel that if you go into that. You probably have experience with that as well with your clients. The risk, which is part of my reservation with working only with somatic experiencing, is that we regulate everything away so that the client is always calm and they meditate every day and they stay calm, and that they kind of lose the fact that they got dysregulated because something is not right for them. So if we regulate too strongly or too fast, topics that actually need to be addressed kind of get out of focus. So this is just one side note to when you think of working bottom up, but we do need somebody's neocortex online. So that's a basic condition to do therapy, to do talking therapy. Top down is the other approach, which is, for example, the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy, but also Psychosynthesis has a lot of components to that. And when we talk about top down, we're working about how we need to also psychoeducate our clients a little bit about how trauma works. And that, for example, if the client starts to repeat stories, relive the experiences, want to go back to the time that is in the past that we cannot change, that there is a risk of them re-traumatizing themselves, which then can lead to strong beliefs and identifications from the survivor subpersonality that, of course, is there for a good reason, which was the part that helped them through at the time, right? So again, back to the example I gave earlier, if somebody has been violated, they might have a very strong belief that people are not to be trusted, even if those people don't mean anything other than well, that somebody just doesn't take that, right? So they're identified with people are a threat. So on the one hand, we need to address the survivor subpersonality and normalize it, and on the other hand, approach it with so much love and compassion that we see like, okay, this is really this has helped you a lot, but is the threat still there, or is it over? So that new neural pathways can be created, because otherwise somebody keeps stuck in the loop, which is of course the effect of trauma. So we're supporting the client in creating new neural pathways. For example, although it may sound very simple, like in this example that I was giving earlier, is like, do you have any experience where actually you met nice people and they were kind to you and they didn't mean anything other than being kind, and actually up to today that's proven? And they might come up with little stories like, yeah, but then they said something quite unkind, and you see, but then, okay, but look at the bigger picture. So overall, were they kind people? And yeah, they were people, they were human beings, so they might have said something that wasn't quite attuned to what you needed or what you wanted to hear in that moment, but overall, so we kind of bring them back into a reality check. A core element in this is that we address the adult. You are more capable of dealing with life now, assuming that that's the kind of clients that you run into your private practice, than you were as a child back then. So whether you've experienced childhood trauma or not, but people can get into this child consciousness state where they feel helpless, they feel incapable, they feel they are small, and they can't change the situation because they regress into that part of themselves, and there's nothing much to find there. And the other perspective in this is that we address the adult consciousness that can counterbalance and acknowledge that the survival subpersonality has certain qualities that we can actually use in life, and I'll say more about that. So, and And this is all from the perspective that unconsciously, from the way we look at the world, we are at risk of reenacting traumas, right? So picking the wrong partners, staying too long in a job that doesn't suit you, or people are not being very kind to you or even use you in that role. There's all kind of ways how people reenact trauma. So won't go too much into that now, but I'll say a little bit more around this topic later. Do number 4, working on capacity and agency. I already mentioned the capacity. So we use co-regulation and we promote disidentification. Like, okay, so that is part of your experience and you're more than that experience, right? So we're kind of trying to invite in that they have a bigger experience than they might be aware of or that they identify with unconsciously in the moment, right? So that's part of our role to remind them of that. I would recommend that you regulate, but only needed to the level that the client needs to get back in touch with their life force, their will, and therefore their agency, that they have the capacity to steer, make willful or conscious choices in their life rather than things happening to them, right? So if they're very victim identified. So we might be able to use biopsychological and emotional completion, as I mentioned earlier, in the sense of what movement, either emotionally or physically, didn't you make, but do you still have to make to renegotiate your relationship with the memory of things, how they were at the time, and remind yourself that you are in a different place now, hopefully in a safer place. Of course, that doesn't apply to everyone. And then other things are needed, but that's not for tonight. And we sometimes might confront the client if needed, and bring them back gently into the work when they start to deflect, when they hear they have to take responsibility and they say like, yeah, but, and then they start to bring a story about that they really can't take the responsibility because there's a boss, there's a partner, there's the bad weather, there's always things that they experience as why they can't change anything, and to kind of gently reflect that back and say, okay, you can't have control over everything, but there are elements where you do have control over. And how would you want to assert your will in those situations, right? Be that a strong will, a skillful will, or even a loving will. More time for questions, but not today. Going to the don'ts. So these are just the parts that you rather not do. Stories are not always true and now, with which I mean clients tell themselves stories, and they do that both to make sense of the world as well as to find evidence that what they believe is true. It's a very human trait, I would say, but it's not always very helpful. First of all, memory is very unreliable, as we know from research. People remember things, but it's the parts of the event they stored and left out other parts of the same story, or the memories got distorted over time. There's a lot of research kind of proving that. But the main point of this also is that we want to see what we believe in, because then we know it's true. Because if we see things that are not in accordance with our belief system, it's very confusing. We lose our orientation, so we need orientation. However, you're not, as a therapist, you take that with a pinch of salt. You just listen to it, but you listen on a symbolic level. What's the client telling me here? What is he or she trying to communicate to me through telling this story? And the other element that I already mentioned, but to remind yourself, is that clients tend to adhere meaning to bodily sensations and overly focus on symptoms that have a psychosomatic origin, with which I mean that if people constantly recall like, oh, I get so much pressure on my chest when I have to do this presentation at work, and they start to focus completely on the body. But the thing is, okay, what are they afraid of? So we start to address the story, but on another level, which is like, what is it that you fear that will happen if this presentation at work? Do you feel you're being judged? Do you feel you fear that people are looking at you? That perhaps you've had bad experience in the past, that you start to stumble or you lose the line of thinking. So what is it that you're afraid of, going to the emotional state rather than the overly focus on symptoms? if you are going along with the story of the client, then you lose your neutrality. And I think that's needed so that you keep the space to ask questions, to observe, reflect back. I see you reflect back what you see, for example, in the body of the client. So what's happening? I see you're blushing, or I see you're looking down now. It seems like you're going a little bit more inside. So just reflect that very neutrally back so that the client starts to track their own responses to getting in touch with the trauma energy in themselves and to make more sense of that. And also and part of that is that we confront, of course, very kindly and very gently, and when it's the right time, the client with their identifications and beliefs that they have around themselves, around how the world turns, etc., etc. And these ideas also lead to physical symptoms when there's no medical cause, so they need to be held loosely. And I don't know what's that like for you in your practice, but I do get people referred from their GP that they've gone through all kind of hospital investigations medically, and nothing comes out. There's nothing wrong with the body. The blood values are all fine, and yet they have these very strong symptoms because they somatize, right? So we kind of explore that, and we hold again their identification with their body loosely. So if we look at a guiding principle in working with the body, is that where is their expansion? So when you notice the client kind of relaxes or takes a deeper breath, and you mirror that back, like, I see you're taking a deeper breath now. It seems that you're relaxing a little bit into the body. You're letting go a bit of the tension. And when there is contraction, like the other way around, of course, if somebody starts to have different facial expressions, or you can see them in the body, or they start to turn. So whatever is that you see, there's a contracting movement, and just reflecting that very kindly back so that they become more and more aware of, hey, what process is happening in me right now, and how's my body kind of communicating that back. So don't number 2. So perceive the client as a child. They're an adult. So that's the don't. So don't perceive them as a child. They're an adult. There's a few more slides on this. So when the client easily regresses into states of despair, helplessness, hopelessness, I already mentioned this earlier, we risk that the client's story is kind of becoming an overwhelming experience for the client. So they lose the agency. They just go back into the story, right? And this is a story in the past by default. Otherwise, you can't bring it to therapy. So think of people who burn themselves out, land in a crisis of meaning, not setting healthy boundaries in whatever situation, not taking care of their needs, etc., etc. So many different circumstances where they kind of step out of their agency, out of their power. So when we refer the client to the child consciousness, we refer to a child state that they might have experienced when they were a child, when they really had no agency over their lives, and adults needed to take care, needed to set boundaries, protect them, and they didn't. So this needs to be acknowledged, because that's where the life energy got stuck. And the acknowledgement is kind of seeing the person in their experience then, but in here and now is inviting him back their life energy for it to start flowing again. So from where the client is now, when they come to see you in your practice, they have an adult consciousness, and they can have empathy for what they might have been through as a child. So they now have more skills, they have more qualities, they can have different perspectives, and which means they're more skillful to relate to their current situation than they were in the time they were a child. And there is a risk that if we start to take over from the client because they're in this helpless state and they don't know, and you tell me that if we step in, instead of leaving the process with the client, then we signal that you can't do this on your own. It's too difficult for you, you're helpless, so I need to help you, which creates a dependence on the therapist, which is a process that we rather not engage with. So we trust that the adult consciousness offers the client the perspectives that they need to change their relationship with the past events. And this doesn't necessarily mean, by the way, that the client has had childhood trauma. It's just a child consciousness state means any state with anyone, because everyone has been a child, where they have experienced that actually they don't have access to their qualities, so they're not capable of accessing their resources that they now actually do as an adult, assuming that we work on capacity, as I mentioned earlier, that they actually do have access to that. So addressing the agency and their responsibility for the process is the way that we work, and we acknowledge that we are the witness of that. We see them in their power, in their potency, and we support that. Adaptive survival strategies, if you've been in one of my trainings earlier, you might have heard the term, is actually the survival personality. So this has helped the person in the trauma to get through it. So emotional completion, as we talked about it, is the way to move forward for the client, which means taking a relational risk most of the time that they avoided so far. So somebody that speaks up for their needs takes the risk that somebody says, well, you might need that, but I don't want to give that to you, or I don't want to take that into account. Or they avoid conflict because they're afraid of anger, an anger response of the other person, or they avoid conflict because they're very afraid of their own aggression, so that if they go into a conflict, that the whole world will fall apart because they become very aggressive. So emotional completion is also a way to own that life energy, both in its expression in pain that has been avoided, grief that has been avoided, but also somebody's aliveness in terms of expressing their assertion, expressing their angry, their healthy boundaries. And that means, again, that they take a relational risk that they might have avoided so far. And the emotions that could not be completed in the moment of trauma are also the ones that stop accessing the qualities of the the adaptive survival strategy. So you could say it in Psychosynthesis terms differently, that the survivor personality has qualities because it helped the client through, and they're here now, and they come to therapy. So there's qualities in that. But as long as somebody's identified with the fear that comes from the trauma, then they don't have access to these qualities freely, right? So we see how it served the client then, how it was reactive, because it had to, because there was no choice, and how could it be of use from awareness and choice when the quality is freed up. So, and an adult who's able to contain emotions can experience the moments of trauma and give space to that without it being an overwhelming experience, without them dissociating or falling into deep pitch. I might be going a bit fast, but you can pause this recording at any time or just listen to it again. Another don't number 3, change your clients, with which I mean, however much a client says and wants it, or say they want it, we are not there to change the clients if we work with trauma. Most, but not all, suffering comes from our relationship to our circumstances. So think of Asa Jolie's Freedom in Jail, and The Will to Meaning from Viktor Frankl, where they wrote about that it's not about what happens to you, but about how you relate to what happens to you, by which I don't mean that if you're now in a situation where there's a war or in a very abusive, toxic environment, that that individual's situation is very bad. But it's really, in the end, it's about where change is happening, is where, and when you have influence over that change, is where our relationship to these circumstances is pivotal to how that lands into your system, also towards the future. And there's a risk that if we buy into the wish of the client to change, that both the therapist and the client set themselves up to potential failure, because how do we know the client changes, and what's the idea, what's the belief behind this long for change? And therefore, we do a slightly different approach. And as I mentioned it earlier, we inquire into what is it that the client deeply longs for themselves? And we can look at how they use their agency to change what they have influence over? Do they actually use their influence? Like if somebody's in a toxic relationship, in a toxic work environment, not everyone, but there is in the Western world, for a lot of people, there is a choice that you can actually change that by changing the circumstances. However, there's also things that they cannot change, and can we come to a place of acceptance instead of keeping fighting something that you can't accept, like what Pastor Jerry wrote about, that he was in jail, so he was imprisoned. He couldn't change that situation, but he writes about how did he kind of start to change his relationship to those circumstances so that he came to a place of more acceptance. And the interesting thing is that once we accept it, we accept our limitation, that can lead to using our will to more expansion. And then we keep exploring how that change, so the change to, not the change of circumstances, how that might change their life. So we explore that until we find that they get into another state change, you could say, and you can see that both in the body, somebody relaxing more, or there's an effect. So there's an emotion coming up, like somebody is sad because they allow the emotion to come through about how they have been clinging on to a situation, or whatever the situation is. You can think of different emotional responses to when they actually change their relationship with whatever happened. So if we work with clients, we can only contract that we're willing to work with them what they really would want and what would get in the way of that deepest longing that they have. Because we can only work with the obstacles. We work a lot with obstacles in psychosynthesis. So what gets in the way of you becoming yourself, right? The process of self, you could say. Okay, the last don't, number 4, always putting your client first, so don't do that. By which I mean that we have a high risk of burning out and suffering from vicarious trauma, from all the trauma that we witness from our clients. So self-care is the most important requirement for us to be able to stay conscious, present, open, and be there with an open heart. Now, pain is part of the human existence, and we're not superhuman, superwoman, superman. So what do we need to do in terms of self-care when we are actually witnessing a lot of suffering, a lot of pain? And there's a risk of therapeutic narcissism, how it's referred to, and probably from our early own childhood wounding, is that we think we must save the whole world, all our clients, and with the risk of role modeling the same childhood trauma reaction in us to our clients, that they also have to be able to always be able to save themselves and perhaps the world around them. So that's not what we want to role model. So that was number 4. Well, that was the last round of questions, again, which we're not going to do. But I do hope that if you made it to this point, you made it through, you listened to the whole presentation. And I hope it was of use somehow. Probably there's a lot of questions that come up because this might bring in some slightly different perspective than what you've heard so far. Perhaps it's just a confirmation of how you work, which I hope it is, because that means we're on the same page in our approach. And it might be that you have a very different working model, and just stay curious about what might this newness that you heard today be of use or of value, as well as honoring the way you work and the way you think your work works as well. Thank you for your attention, and hope to see you another time. And there's going to be, in October, there's going to be a 3-day seminar exploring sexuality and sexual trauma, also organized by the Föreningen. So if you're interested, you might also might join that. It's going to be near Landvetter, near Gothenburg. So perhaps I see you there. Thank you for your attention.